reaching from way down here. From way down here.
Welcome to Thread, a podcast designed to explore God's story and lead you into a full life in Christ.
Thank you for joining us in this conversation, co-hosted by myself, Hannah D'Souza, and Dr. David Pocta.
Though I'm way down here, I get a better view of this boundless world that I'm going to.
Hello everyone and welcome back to Thread. We are at episode 25 today and we are talking about the Tabernacle. So it's the penultimate episode in this series, God's Nation Formed. So we have one left after this.
Okay.
And I'm excited to jump in. It's a big
Well,
topic.
first you have to explain why you're in a different location today.
Yeah. So I had some water coming through the ceiling of my dorm room.
Oh,
So right now they are replacing the floor above me, which is where the leak was coming from. And I'm in a temporary room. I had to bring my plants.
is Gilgamesh
didn't-
there?
He is right there.
How's he
at the
doing?
bottom. Okay. The other ones are more
Vibrant.
blooming. Yeah. But I didn't want the builders to be left with my plants. So I took
fair
those
enough.
with me.
Well, and the listeners
Yeah.
demand seeing Gilgamesh. So,
I do.
This is going to be a tricky episode. There's so much detail to the tabernacle. And it does seem like, in each of these podcasts, we're introducing something new and significant to the story. Already in this series, we've learned about a lot of new things: theophanies, salvation paradigms, the role of wilderness in shaping communities, God's presence manifesting itself for our benefit and relationship. And we talked last time about the law and the priesthood. This episode, we step into this first official temple constructed for Yahweh. And in some ways, it ties into the discussion we had with Dr. Bernie McGinn on God's presence, because Yahweh is making himself known to Israel and making a place to dwell among them. So we even have a little show and tell planned, Hannah, for
We
today.
do.
Yeah.
So if you are listening on audio, it might be good to switch if you're able to towards the end,
today,
right?
You're right. This would be a good one for YouTube or the app, because there's a lot. And you're going to want to download the extra PDFs probably for this episode too. It's a good point. So Hannah, we have a key verse that kind of sets this whole thing up in Exodus 25, 8 and 9. And how about if you lead us off with that verse?
Okay. So it says, "And they shall make me a sanctuary, so that I may dwell among them, in accordance with all that I show you concerning the pattern of the tabernacle and of all its furniture, so you shall make it."
Yeah, so now Yahweh is telling Moses that he wants them to build a sanctuary. And he tells us why. This sanctuary is so that he may dwell among them. And then he says, I'm going to give you the pattern of this tabernacle. And we will see in the rest of the book of Exodus a lot of detail about this thing and what it's supposed to look like and how it's supposed to be constructed. So there will be significant details given. In fact, the third of the book of Exodus is devoted to the tabernacle. And it's referred to kind of three different ways in this discussion. So we pick up some of that even in this verse, but then we're going to see as Exodus continues that it's referred to differently. So these three things are: it's referred to as the sanctuary, it's referred to as the tabernacle, and it's referred to as the tent of meeting. So there's a different emphasis about what role this plays as that expression changes. So when you think about sanctuary, it clearly communicates holiness. I think it communicates the transcendence of God. Now, maybe we could talk about transcendence a minute. How would you define transcendence, Hannah? As I put you on the spot here. Not planned.
Dave loves to go off script. Transcendence. I'd say like otherworldly, like not the common, kind of above us.
Yeah, so when we think about the transcendence of God, we're thinking about the fact that God is, in the heavens. He's beyond us. He's our creator. Now, we also can think about, which we're going to see in a minute, the immanence of God, which is God near us, the closeness of God. Both are true. It's an important tension that we have to hold. But there's two verses that kind of describe the importance of the sanctuary concept in Leviticus about the tabernacle and this posture that God takes with us in this space. So Leviticus 10:10 and Leviticus 11:45, if you could read those.
You are to distinguish between the holy and the common, and between the unclean and the clean. And you are to teach the Israelites all the statutes that the Lord has spoken to them through Moses. And then Leviticus 11:45 says, For I am Yahweh, who brought you up from the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall be holy, for I am holy.
So the concept of sanctuary really talks about this separateness of God, the fact that God is other than we are in our unclean sense ourselves. And that's what the tabernacle will do. The tabernacle will be in this white linen fence that separates the rest of the community out from where Yahweh resides. So in that sense, this is viewed as a sanctuary. It also provides an avenue for Israel's holiness. So when we see in that second verse, Leviticus 11, it says, You shall be holy as I am holy. The idea is that Yahweh wants us to participate in that holiness. And this tabernacle, this sanctuary, will give us that opportunity. So it not only impresses upon Israel the holiness of God and his concerns and intentions for the holiness of his people as well. So that's the way we think about this as a sanctuary. This is called also a tabernacle, which is what we called the episode. And this expresses more the presence or immanence of God. Tabernacle means to be in a tent, right? It's Yahweh will dwell among them. So Yahweh brought Israel into the wilderness to live in tents. Yahweh will also live in a tent. He will tabernacle among them. So if we understand the importance of those, I mean, we look at the difference there, right? So we see Yahweh wants us to see him as separate, as holy, but he also wants us to see him as present and in our lives. So we really look at, when you're looking at Exodus and all these instructions from Exodus 25, really through Exodus 27, 19 times, Exodus refers to this as the tabernacle. Now, there's an important distinction that has to be made because tabernacle kind of gets used in two different ways that mean different things. So there's the tabernacle as in the whole complex, and there's tabernacle as in the actual space where the tent is inside the courtyard. And there is an important difference there, and that'll become more clear as we look at some pictures and we do some show and tell here.
Okay. So it's also a verb as well, to tabernacle.
Yeah, it is. So to tabernacle would be to intent. And we're going to see that come up in the New Testament.
Spoiler.
People have to wait for a year to know what that is.
Yeah. Well, I could just
maybe
Hebrews.
we'll say something about that at the end of this episode.
Okay.
So yeah, go ahead.
So the tent of meeting is inside the tabernacle, because I think sometimes I've conflated the two. I remember when I was younger and not really understood.
Actually, you were right to conflate the two. So this is the point. That's the third way that it's referred to. So in the later chapters of Exodus, it's referred to as the tent of meeting. And the reason that the language shifts is it goes from being a tent to a place where they engage. Now we're talking about the ministry of the priests, the function that they will play. So what we see in those last few chapters is actually all the instructions for what the priests are supposed to do in the tabernacle. And that's why Yahweh refers to it as the tent of meeting 15 times. So it goes from, 19 times being described as tabernacle to 15 times being described as tent of meeting, referring to the same space, but talking more about the function that it will play.
Okay.
So you were right. How about that?
Yay.
Yay.
I'm glad, because it can be confusing.
So this beautiful structure which when we start getting into it and we start understanding all the colors and the materials and the gems and the metal, I mean, it's incredible. So Yahweh not only designs it, but he asks people to provide a free will offering before they build it. So he lays out, here's what it's going to be all about. Now, Israel, you're welcome to give. Like, nothing's demanded, but you are welcome to give, except for one piece. We're going to get to this a little bit later. There is one tax that Israel has to pay that will cover one part of this, but that's another thing we'll get to in a little while. So this free will offering, I mean, there is a lot of gold and a lot of bronze and a lot of gemstones and a lot of materials that are going to be given freely to build this, honestly, engineering masterpiece. So fun story, Hannah. When my wife and I led, we used to run the teen camps in the Midwest family of churches in our fellowship. And we decided one year that we were going to devote I decided, and I had to win over the whole rest of the planning team. I wanted to do a whole year on the Tabernacle.
Oh, wow.
So our friends in Chicago will probably remember this. And I actually wanted to figure out what would it take to build a life-size replica of the Tabernacle with like plywood and ropes. And I mean, just so people had a general idea. No gold.
No gold and bronze. Okay.
But even to go to Home Depot and try to build at that time with tarps and plywood, and the bill was $10,000 just for the materials to construct the size of this thing. So needless to say,
you needed a free will offering.
Yeah, we did. We did not take up the free will offering. But we had a lot of fun that year talking about all these elements of the tabernacle. And so I always like teaching and talking about this. I think it's a fun thing for us to dive into. So I want to first address these kind of 5 major things that the tabernacle does. What is it? Why does it hold such significance and importance in our history? And there's really 5 major things. One is, we've already kind of talked about, it's a dwelling place for Yahweh among his people. There's an image here that if we look at, it's kind of this artistic rendition of what it may have been like to stand on a hill looking down at the encampment of all 12 tribes and then all the priests surrounding this tent of meeting, this tabernacle, this sanctuary, and the presence of God coming up from it in the middle, which is a beautiful artistic rendition that people can see. But I also created a diagram here to show the layout of what this would have been like. The important thing about where the tabernacle was if you remember when Moses used to go to see Yahweh at the tent of meeting, it was outside the camp. He would go meet and talk with Yahweh outside the camp. When the tabernacle was built, it was built right in the middle of the camp. So this next diagram we have shows all 12 tribes of Israel, and that 3 were on the north, 3 were on the south, 3 were east, and 3 were west. It also shows that on the inside of the tribes were these 4 families of priests. So Aaron and his family was on the east side. And then we have the Merarites, the Gershonites, the Kohathites on the other sides. And I'm like, man, this stuff gets, detailed and technical. And we'll talk just a little bit about why that is, but we'll come back to that in just a minute. The third diagram that I have here is kind of a 3-dimensional artistic drawing of what it would have looked like. So you can see the white linen fence around the outside that separates this sanctuary from the people. And then you see the actual tabernacle tent, or the tent of meeting, is a tent inside this courtyard. And before you get to it, you see an altar and a laver. And we're going to, again, explain those things in a little bit. But those pictures I thought would be helpful just to give people some context.
Yeah.
So there's 3 families of priests that directly surround the actual tabernacle, as I said. So all of these are described as people that are between the ages of 30 and 50 that will provide a specific service to the tabernacle. Now, Aaron and his family are the ones that do the ministering inside. They're the only ones that go actually inside and light the incense and replace the bread and all those things. Kohathites, and this is kind of fascinating, of the 30 to 50-year-old Kohathites, there were 2,750 men of that age, and their job was to take care of the holy things. So when the tent moved, and I don't even remember this. Do you remember when it says the pillar of cloud or the pillar of fire were to lift up and move? Do you remember what was supposed to happen?
No.
Yeah. Okay, that's fine.
Did it,
I'm
wait, did it
putting you on the spot
descend?
today.
I know you are. I'm trying to picture it.
Yeah.
I think I'm also amazed at how elaborate that would have been to move.
That's
I
exactly the
didn't
point.
picture it before until now you're talking about it.
That's what's so fascinating about this engineering masterpiece. It was created not just to be this presence of Yahweh in this tabernacle, but it had to be mobile. So
Wow.
what it says in scripture is anytime the pillar of cloud or pillar of fire would lift up and move, they were supposed to break camp.
Yeah. Wow. Oh my gosh.
So the Kohathites' job was to make sure that the most holy things got moved properly. That was their job.
Mm.
The Gershonites' job was to carry the curtains, the tent of meeting and its covering, all the fine leather, the screen that breaks up the tent of meeting, the hangings in the court. I mean, so they had all these pieces that they were supposed to carry. And the Merarites had to carry all the framing, the bars, the pillars, the bases. I mean, they had a lot of the heavy lifting to do. So there's an entire devoted family. Now, in the Merarites, there were 3,200 of them that were moving all these pieces whenever the pillar of cloud would move. Isn't that amazing?
Oh my goodness. Well, I'm starting to understand why it was $10,000 to do a replica of this.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Well, wait till we get to some of the fine materials that are used. So that's one thing, right? One thing that was really important about the tabernacle was it was a dwelling place for Yahweh among his people. And when the pillar would move, the tabernacle would move, and then all of the tribes of Israel would fall in a specific order as they would move together through the wilderness, which had to just be a sight, by the way.
Oh my gosh, epic.
It had to be a sight. Okay, second thing, it was a center for worship and sacrifice. So this is, and we talked about this a little bit in the last episode about law and priesthood. This is where all these sacrifices took place for atonement and thanksgiving and communion with God. The third thing the tabernacle became was a really important symbol of God's covenant with Israel. So it was this constant reminder that Yahweh made a covenant with us. And inside the very, and I'm going to test you on this one later. So listen closely to this, right? The test is coming at the end of the episode,
Okay.
Hannah. See, I'm totally surprising Hannah for all of our listeners.
Yeah,
Too. She
this
doesn't
whole
know
thing.
any of this was coming.
I'm listening along with you guys for the first time.
So inside the Ark of the Covenant, which was inside the most holy place, there were three things that Yahweh wanted inside there.
I feel like
Are you writing these down?
Yeah. I'm like, I don't want to be caught off guard.
Oh, you can. This is not overly complicated. It's okay. So one thing was the golden jar of manna. So they were to have this jar of manna that they kept as a reminder of how Yahweh fed them in the desert. Okay. The second thing was Aaron's staff, which had budded, was an important story that
almonds.
The staff gets put in there. And the third is, it actually says in Exodus 25:16, you shall put the covenant I am giving you in the ark. In other words, those stone tablets that were inscribed by the finger of God were also to be kept in there. So the three things, the golden jar of manna, Aaron's staff, and the 10 commandments. Okay, good. We're going to come back to that. All right, so number 4. So the tabernacle is a symbol of God's covenant. The fourth thing is it becomes a prototype of temple worship. And we're going to see as they move into the promised land, and eventually David wants to build a permanent house. And I don't know if you remember this, but he says, how can you live? How can I live in this beautiful palace and you live in a tent? Right? So he wanted to build Yahweh a temple. And because of the blood he shed in battle, he wasn't allowed to, and his son Solomon did. And we have the first temple built by Solomon. But that's important. The tabernacle actually set the pattern, both for the way that the temple would be structured, but also for all the religious practices that would be, all the sacrifices and practices that were put into play.
Yeah, that was a question I had thought of, was the way in which the Israelites are instructed to relate to the tabernacle, whether that would be similar to how they would relate to the temple. And
That's
kind of those
exactly right.
main what were their significant differences though too?
Well, so think about this as a typology and a fulfillment that really begins with Eden, right? Eden was this temple city where Yahweh was living amongst his people, Adam and Eve. And because of the unholiness, they were separated from the temple space, right? And that was the whole East of Eden thing. They had to go east of Eden. Interesting, when we get to where the gate is on the east side, by the way, of the courtyard. So they have to leave this temple city. Now, Yahweh recreates this foreshadowing temple, this typology of a temple in a tent. Then it becomes a permanent structure in the temple itself. And then we're going to see, and the very next thing we were going to talk about was how it's foreshadowing Jesus, which we'll get to in a minute. But then ultimately, we're going to see it fulfilled in heaven. And that heaven is described as this cube that's the same dimensions as the holy place. And we see a lot of these connections in the book of Hebrews and in the book of Revelation, which we can't talk about now because we're in the Old Testament. And people are going to have to tune in year 2 and 3, right, for those things. So really good question. So a lot of these rituals, priesthood functions, design elements were mirrored in the temple. And yes, all those practices were continued. The thing that changes is it's no longer portable and mobile. So you don't have to have all those priesthood families living surrounding it, although priests still had to service in there. So the fifth thing, so that was the fourth, right? The fourth was it was a prototype for the temple worship that was to come. And the fifth is, this is our little piece of the New Testament we have to talk about just a little bit. It is a foreshadowing of Jesus and redemption. In Christian theology, the tabernacle is often seen as a foreshadowing of Jesus. And in John 1:14, one of my favorite verses that really displays this in all its glory. Now, we miss a little in the English, but if you could read the English for us in John 1:14, and then we'll talk about the Greek.
And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth.
So John describes the coming of Jesus as the Word becoming flesh and living amongst us. The Greek actually says he tabernacled amongst us, which is so powerful, right?
Yeah, the verb.
So all of these elements that we're going to see, and I'm just going to encourage people today to start thinking about the connections for themselves, because we're not going to do the work, right? We're not going to go through and say, this meant this about Jesus, this meant this. That is a fascinating study. And I'm going to include a PDF for people to download where they can look at all those connections and read those New Testament passages. I think we'll do a whole episode next year on how Jesus was a fulfillment of the tabernacle, and we'll talk about the other side of this. But right now, it's just important to know that it was a foreshadowing of Christ and redemption. So the tabernacle was not just a physical structure. It was a multifaceted symbol of God's presence, his provision, his promise to his people with covenant, and it has this enduring spiritual significance.
I think at times when I've read these passages and the long descriptions about the construction of the tabernacle, it's easy to kind of get lost in them. There's so much detail, there's a lot of imagery and the cherubim and the curtains and the cubit length. And something that was cool when I was reading a commentary at Exodus in preparation for this episode was they'd mentioned how the first person in the Bible that's described as being filled with the Spirit is Bezalel in Exodus 31, who's one of the who's an artist, and he's
Yes.
kind of commissioned to do these artistic designs in gold and silver. And I thought that was so interesting that he is filled with the Spirit for that purpose, which does speak to God's valuing of beauty. And we talked about that in Creation and Beauty, episode 5, I think. But yeah, there's a sense at the same time that this is more than just decor or ornamental.
Yep.
Yeah. How would you suggest we're meant to treat these passages then? I think when I was younger, I definitely gloss over them.
Right.
But I mean, they're there, and it's clear that there's an importance to God, the specificity and the detail.
Well, I love that you bring that up. It's one of my favorite things about this story is that God gives this spirit of wisdom and artistic ability to create this beautiful thing, right? And so this imagery begins with all this description of color. And on the sheet that we'll give to people, they'll see a lot of symbolism, what blue represented, what scarlet represented, what purple represented. Of course, white with righteousness, gold always represented deity, silver was all about redemption, bronze was about judgment. That all these things have a sense of meaning. And so creating this beautiful structure, there were layers and layers of meaning that were all expressed in this artistic way. And that was such an important part to Yahweh about constructing this, that he would give his spirit to an artist to build this, and that he would ask for this free will offering that was very costly. The tabernacle itself, I thought about years ago. I think when I first researched this, I think the cost was to build it 20 years ago in today's cost of gold and silver and all those things was around $20 million. I think the estimates are now somewhere around $40 million if we were to build it today. But, of course, we're guessing with a lot of these details, but it's an expensive structure with all the beautiful things that are in it. So,
I
yeah,
imagine it was special for people to feel like they contributed to that.
Right. That's a great point. Yeah. So I think this is a good cue for show and tell.
Okay. I'm excited.
Right. I mean, to really kind of get our head around what this is. And as you bring it up, and a lot of times we just kind of skip over this. We don't really understand the significance of it. So some of the show and tell will be, I have my own tabernacle model, as one does. You
I'm
do
not
too, right? You have
surprised.
your own tabernacle model.
I'm in a very stark room right now. I
Yeah,
just
no
about have a
tabernacle
lamp.
model.
Yeah.
So when we did this tabernacle camp instead of being able to build this big, life-size structure, I found this beautiful 2-scale model of the tabernacle pieces. And then they also found that they create these paintable, buildable models of the tabernacle. So we divided the entire camp of 120 campers into 12 tribes. We gave them all t-shirts. They each had to wear they were each part of one of the tribes. They were all different colors. We had it printed in Hebrew and in English. And then we gave each of them a model. And as I taught through the tabernacle each day, they would paint parts of the model. And so by the end of the week, they had constructed their own tabernacle.
Wow.
I don't know if I should apologize now. I mean, these poor kids, they come to camp and they're painting tabernacle models. We had a lot of fun too, but I thought it was fun. Yeah. So this PDF that people can download goes through these kind of 12 things that we're going to talk through, and we'll move through these pretty quickly because of time, but I want to at least do a little show and tell here. I think it'll be helpful. So we already talked about the location that's right in the middle of the camp. So that's one thing. The second is the courtyard itself. And there's this really neat picture. So this picture that you're seeing now is actually a recreated model of the tabernacle out in the desert. And I have a couple pictures that I had from years ago of some different views of this. So it does give you an idea of just what that linen fence would have looked like and how that tabernacle would have been set back and where the altar was and all that. So you can see the courtyard. The courtyard is the section that is created between the fence and the actual tent itself. Now, the next picture is the gate, and you'll notice that the gate was very different than the rest and it was on the east side, as we already talked, right? So Adam and Eve were removed to the east of the garden. We enter from the east to come back into the courtyard, which is fascinating. Hannah, there's a
Yeah.
great verse here, if you could read in Exodus 27:16, and it describes the beauty of the gate.
For the entrance to the courtyard, provide a curtain 20 cubits long of blue, purple, and scarlet yarn and finely twisted linen, the work of an embroiderer, with 4 posts and 4 bases.
Yeah, so the gate was very clear. There was only one way in. Again, people can draw their own conclusions about Jesus being the gate and all those things, but that was the uniqueness of the gate. The fourth thing is the altar itself. Now, the altar, now we start getting into the actual pieces that are inside the courtyard. The altar was made of bronze. Everything outside the tabernacle was bronze. Everything inside is gold. That was part of you would feel this as you're coming in from the gate. You see bronze. Bronze represents judgment, sacrifice. There was a ramp needed to reach it. It was high up, and it was this big grate. Now, here, I have this is like the
You have the
biggest, hardest
visuals.
piece to show, right?
Oh my goodness.
This is kind of what that would look like. And you see the posts on it.
Yeah. So
There's
that would have been bronze.
This is all bronze. Yep. It's actually really heavy.
It looks
those posts were there so that the priest could carry it. I mean, I'm trying to imagine how many people it would have taken to carry that thing from spot to spot. But you imagine the size of this when you're taking a large, full-grown cow or ram or goat that has to be sacrificed on that. And they would tie them down with the horns on the altar. So it was significant size. The next and the only other piece in bronze was the laver. The laver, or the basin, was the only thing in the tabernacle. Here's my little laver.
Okay. Nice.
It's the only thing that didn't have dimensions, which I always find interesting, right? And yet it was extremely important. And I think you have to read this verse for us, Hannah, because we see how significant it was that the priests washed at the laver before they went into the tent of meeting. So in Exodus 30:17, you want to read that one?
Okay, to 21.
Yeah.
Is what I've highlighted. Okay. The Lord spoke to Moses. You shall make a bronze basin with a bronze stand for washing. You shall put it between the tent of meeting and the altar, and you shall put water in it. With the water, Aaron and his sons shall wash their hands and their feet. When they go into the tent of meeting, or when they come near the altar to minister, to make an offering by the fire to the Lord, they shall wash with water, so that they may not die. They shall wash. That's intense. Had to pause there.
Right? Exactly.
Like, oh. And the last verse, I think it says, they shall wash with their hands and their feet so that they may not die. It shall be a perpetual ordinance for them, for him and for his descendants throughout their generations.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
They have to wash so they will not die. When they come into the presence of God, if they were not ritually clean, they would die.
I think that tension you spoke about with the kind of transcendence and the immanence is kind of really visible here. Like God's near, but there's regulations.
Holy.
And he's holy, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's powerful. So that's the laver. So laver is the last thing that happens before you're in the presence of God. Again, it makes me think about the role that water plays in this kind of cleansing, coming into the presence of God. So then we get to the tabernacle itself, this tent. Now, part of what's amazing about this tent is that the top doesn't just have a covering that protects it. It actually has 4 layers. Part of what's amazing about that is you're only going to really see 2 layers. You're going to see the layer from the top that protects it. And then you're going to see the layer when you're inside. And again, it's only the high priest and their family that's inside. But when you're inside, you're going to see that inside layer. There's 2 hidden layers, but they were important. So the first layer that you would see is the linen layer in Exodus 26:1, if you could.
The tabernacle itself you shall make with 10 curtains of fine twisted linen and blue, purple, and crimson yarns. You shall make them with cherubim skillfully worked into them.
Yeah, so what they would see when they would look up at this first layer is they would see all these colors. The second layer was made of goat's hair. And what's significant about this being a layer of goat's hair is what the goat came to signify in the Day of Atonement. So, have you ever heard of the scapegoat? I'm sure you've heard of that concept, the
Yeah.
scapegoat. That goes all the way back, right, to this idea that on the Day of Atonement, they would send away the sins of the community on a goat that would be sent into the wilderness. And it talks about that in Leviticus 16:21, if you could read that.
Then Aaron shall lay both his hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the iniquities of the Israelites and all their transgressions, all their sins, putting them on the head of the goat and sending it away into the wilderness by means of someone designated for the task. The goat shall bear on itself all their iniquities to a barren region, and the goat shall be set free in the wilderness.
Yeah, so the goat came to represent this idea of our sins being taken as far as the east is from the west. And so you have this layer of goat's hair. Then you have another layer of this red dyed ram skin. And it was dyed red, which of course, crimson, scarlet, the red, the deep red color also becomes very important symbolic for us. And then we see this protective layer, which, just made sure that the whole inside was protected from the elements. The other interesting piece, I said there was only one thing that God asked as a tax that also becomes a significant part of developing the materials for this, and it's the color silver. Silver is the color of redemption. And we see this passage that I thought would be interesting to read based on this conversation about the symbolism and what it will mean in Exodus 30:11-16.
Then the Lord said to Moses, "When you take a census of the Israelites to count them, each one must pay the Lord a ransom for his life at the time he is counted. Then no plague will come on them when you number them. Each one who crosses over to those already counted is to give a half shekel, according to the sanctuary shekel, which weighs 20 gerahs. This half shekel is an offering to the Lord. All who cross over, those 20 years old or more, are to give an offering to the Lord. The rich are not to give more than a half shekel, and the poor are not to give less when you make the offering to the Lord to atone for your lives."
So it's interesting, right? Everyone has to pay the same redemption tax, this atonement tax. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. Redemption or atonement costs the same no matter your status in the community, which also has some interesting connections.
Do we know what half a shekel the equivalent is?
You're not
Is it
supposed to
more
ask me that
symbol?
question, Hannah.
Well,
I have
you
not
asked me some
I
tough ones.
I did. It's fair play. No, I don't. I don't know how much that is. That'd be
Okay,
interesting
we
to
can
look
look it
up.
up.
Yeah. There's a picture that I did put here that people can see of kind of this peeled back 3D view of then what happens on the inside when they're inside this. And we have some of these other pieces that we'll get into now. Number 7 is the lamp. The lamp, I just happen to have this lamp here.
Oh,
Just happen to
nice.
have this lamp.
And that's gold.
Well, it's the real one is gold. This one's
Yeah.
not gold. But yes,
That's
you notice the difference, right? Between the bronze and the gold. It was
right.
very clear, right? That now everything's changed. Gold representing deity. We're now in the presence of God. This was made by one. Now I do know this. It was made by one piece of gold. It was a talent of gold. In other words, 75 pounds or 34 kilograms of gold that was hammered into this lampstand, which is just fascinating. It was kept burning all night long, and it gave light inside where the presence of God was. Then you have a table. This table was responsible for holding the bread. And there were 12 loaves of bread, one for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. Oh, it's not, there we go. one for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. Every Sabbath, they would replace the bread on that table. And again, that representing the whole community, the whole people. And then the last piece that was on that inside what's called the holy place is this altar for the incense. And they would place incense twice a day, in the morning and the evening, and they would burn incense on this altar. So those are the three pieces that were inside what's called the holy place. Then there was this beautiful veil. And we read about this veil in the New Testament when Jesus dies. And we'll come back to that here in just a minute, just briefly. But this veil was beautiful. If you could read Exodus 26, 31 to 33.
Make a curtain of blue, purple, and scarlet yarn, and finely twisted linen, with cherubim woven into it by a skilled worker. Hang it with gold hooks on 4 posts of acacia wood, overlaid with gold and standing on 4 silver bases. Hang the curtain from the clasps and place the Ark of the Covenant law behind the curtain. The curtain will separate the holy place from the most holy place.
Yeah, that's key. So this curtain would separate the holy place where every day they'd be in there ministering. They'd light the incense. They would light the lamp every night. Every week they'd replace the bread. But you never crossed that final curtain into the most holy place except once a year. And only on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, and only by the high priest, who had to go through a whole series of sacrifices and rituals to cleanse himself. So this curtain is the only thing between the presence of God and the community, the actual presence of God. And so it was significant, again, and just for people to think about when the curtain of the temple was torn in two, when Jesus died, what did that signify? That there was no longer anything keeping the community from the presence of God. It was really powerful that that curtain was torn in two. So behind the curtain lies the last thing that we'll talk about here, which is in the most holy place. And we'll talk about the most holy place in just a minute, but this is the last item, the Ark of the Covenant.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, the Ark of the Covenant is gold, and it has 2 cherubim on top. And here's the test, Hannah. What's supposed to be inside this
Okay,
Ark
this
of
is
the
the
Covenant?
thing you told me about.
This is the thing. There were 3
So-
things that were supposed to be in here. Let's see if they're in here.
So we have Aaron's staff, right?
Wait a minute. Let's see if we have Aaron's staff.
I hope so.
There we have Aaron's
Okay.
staff.
Aw. Just about make it out on the camera. And then the golden jar of manna.
The jar of manna. Look at that. Dun-da-da.
Nice.
Yep.
And then was it the 10 Commandments? Okay. Got it.
Yep. Good job. You passed the
A
test.
plus.
Yeah, so these 3 things were kept inside the Ark of the Covenant. And they would only go in once a year. As I said, the high priest would go in once a year, which brings us to number 12 and our final piece, which is the most holy place. This place where the ark would sit, that was only visited once a year, where the presence of God resided. It was also called the mercy seat. It's where God's mercy was met with his people, right? And what's interesting about this is it was a perfect cube in dimensions, meaning the same height and width and depth, which we see that only in creation again in Revelation 21 and 22 when heaven is described. It's the same depth and height and width, representing the most holy place where God resides. So I know that's a really quick journey through all that, and there's a lot to think about there. But do you have any, how do you process all this as we kind of explore what the tabernacle is?
Yeah. I know this is a longer episode, but I think there's so much value in looking at the different components and even getting a sense of what that must have felt like to be in a space like that. I feel like there's something special about having a specific place where you might go to meet with God that's designed in that way with great intention, and that separation from kind of the ordinary that is created in that kind of transcendence you spoke about. It makes me think of just the reverence that would have created, the idea of kind of think about Moses being on holy ground, that sense that we're in something holy. When I lived in Eastern Europe, sometimes I would go into kind of Orthodox churches. There's lots of those around to pray. And I think it was that sense of wanting to step away from the bustle of the street and enter a space that felt separate. There was a time when, like, this is when I was kind of doing some missions work in Eastern Europe, and we spent some time in Istanbul. And there's the Hagia Sophia is there, which just has a really rich history. It used to be an Eastern Orthodox church and a Catholic church during the Crusades, and then became a mosque. And you can kind of see all of that history in that space. But I remember when our group kind of went in to have a look, and we had to take our shoes off, and people were kneeling face to the ground, praying, and I got to join them. Of course, there were Muslims there. It's a mosque now, but I also just prayed to God in that space. And they have a big dome that is meant to replicate the heavens. And there was a real sense of awe. And I know in the tradition that we are in, the fellowship of churches we're in, and I also think evangelicalism, maybe as a whole, the building is not as important necessarily. I know we meet in schools or different places that we can rent. So it's not so clear a distinction as that we're entering a holy place. I think it's worth considering what that might have been like for the Israelites to have a specific place. And I think along with that, there can be sometimes an over-familiarity with God. And I think there is a beauty to the idea of God being everywhere and being present. We don't need a temple now to meet with him, which is amazing. But there's also something to say about not becoming over-familiar and still keeping that sense of awe and reverence. I feel like very much would have been present for the Israelites with this tabernacle. But yeah, I think it's cool as we're moving towards gesturing to what that might be like in the New Testament. I think the tabernacle teaches us so much about the humility of God. He has this throne room in heaven, and then takes up a tent in this temporary structure in the middle of the desert. I think it must have been a really awesome concept for the Israelites to think that this God so wanted to be close to them, that kind of immanence, that he would pitch his tent alongside them and kind of be a fellow pilgrim and lower himself in that way, which of course paves the way for Jesus too. So there's a lot there that is just really rich. Yeah.
Well, and you're right. So, the connections that we'll all come to appreciate is how Jesus becomes a fulfillment of all these wonderful things, which is incredible. And we do have this relationship with God through him, but it doesn't negate the power of space and beauty and location and that kind of special way of processing. It's kind of like we talked with Bernie McGinn about, like, why is it so important to practice the presence of God when God's always there? Because we forget. He said, because we forget. And I think that's what these things do for us, is they help us. It's not that they're necessary, but they can be really helpful to have.
So go build your own tabernacle in your garden.
I know.
Your tent of
know.
meeting.
For years, I've been called a tabernacle nerd. It's true. I embrace it. That's why I still have this thing laying out. This thing just sits in my closet. I've had it for 20 years. I get to bring out my tabernacle today and talk about this. Anyway, we've had a long episode. It's been a great conversation. We're going to tune back in next week and talk about the culture of Israel. So we'll see you next week, Hannah.
See you then. Bye.
Thank you for joining this Thread conversation.
We're more than a podcast. Check out threadpodcast.org for more immersive content.
Though I'm way down here, I get a better view of this boundless world that I